Thank you, Will. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's Lunch and Learn. I am so excited to welcome Congressman Jared Golden. Congressman Golden represents Maine's 2nd Congressional District, where he serves on the Small Business and Armed Services Committees. He is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps and was deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. He also served in Maine's House of Representatives, including as Assistant Majority Leader. Congressman Golden grew up in Leeds, a small town in Androscoggin County, and lives in Lewiston when he's not in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Congressman. Now, my name is Maureen Druin, and I'm Executive Director of Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 8,500 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. Just a few technical notes for today's event. Congressman Golden will start us off with some remarks, but since this really is a conversation, we'll use the bulk of our time together for your questions at the end. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. Please send your questions to Will Sedlak through the chat as they occur to you, and he and I will keep track of your questions and ask them during the Q&A session at the end. You can also message Will if you have any technical difficulties. This event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, along with recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. So thank you all again for joining us, and especially to our guest, Congressman Jared Golden. Congressman Golden, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. I really appreciate the invitation to join you all today. I think it'll be a good hour, I hope. A fun conversation, and I do want to leave the majority of the time for Q&A. I think we discussed a little bit, maybe am I just sharing a few thoughts on my road to Congress and representing the 2nd District. Does that sound about right to you for a good way to kick it off?
That sounds perfect.
Sure. For those of you that don't know me, I grew up in Leeds, Maine, not far from where I live now in Lewiston. Most of my family lives in this area, and small town. If you've ever been through it, you were probably driving on Route 202, heading somewhere between Lewiston and Augusta. Was a largely, I thought growing up, best defined as a dairy town. With a lot of small dairy farms. I know all the families that ran them through the years under a lot of pressure that many dairy farms around the state experienced. A lot of the cows were sold. Just the kind of consolidations going on in that industry, getting tougher and tougher for smaller family farms to make ends meet. They largely went away. Great place to grow up, very involved really all my life in being outdoors. The types of the activities I grew up doing, I just kind of took for granted as the way it is everywhere, not only in Maine, but around the whole country. I obviously now know that's just not 100% the case, and that not everyone does enjoy access to beautiful hiking, the ability to get out on a lake or in a river. And do things like go fishing or swimming, having access to clean water, all kinds of different things that I just kind of took for granted growing up. So I will say that's something that we really, I think, share in common. With those of you who are members of Maine Conservation Voters and others. Really a love of the outdoors, but I think understanding of the importance of access. And when I say that, I mean for everyone possible. In the context of living in downtown Lewiston now, I think of that more than ever, and understanding that there are people in my community who don't have those opportunities, who don't have a place like a summer camp or public access nearby where they can just go swimming or learn how to ice fish or whatever it may be, or ready in quick access to a hiking trail to get outside. It's just critically important. And hiking has been important to me for a number of years. I was actually contemplating the other day, walking with my wife. We're trying to get out and get a little exercise in. She is expecting our first child in early May. But while we were out walking, I thought, geez, when I was young, I used to sometimes, think going out for a hike, was just sometimes more like a chore. When I came home from serving in the military, first in Afghanistan, where I was way up in the Hindu Kush Mountains, and despite the hardness of the mission, surrounded by that beauty, and then after my deployment to Iraq, going through the transition, coming home, which was sometimes difficult, going hiking was actually something that became kind of therapeutic for me. And I've held on to that as best I can ever since coming home in late 2006, early 2007. I tend to enjoy really going out and hiking alone, and I can go for miles and miles and many hours and really enjoy it. Other people want to go hiking groups, whatever it may be, but at the end of the day, ensuring that access, I think, is super important. Anyway, as I think about just my current endeavors and job, I would, I guess, share with you, I didn't really ever anticipate getting into politics. My first entry point was working for Senator Collins on the staff of the Senate Homeland Security Committee. And at the time, I was simply applying for many different jobs in the United States because I was working over in the Middle East. And I was just eager to have a job home in the United States and hopefully, building a career path and putting roots down at home after being in the military, teaching in Afghanistan, and then even working for a freight forwarding company in the Middle East. I felt like I'd spent more of my 20s away than home. When I worked on policies for an elected official, I used to think I would never, ever run for office myself. I didn't want to deal with any of the political side of stuff. I just wanted to focus on policy making and trying to really have an expertise in a specific area. When I moved back home to Maine in 2013, I went to work in the State House for then Majority Leader Seth Berry, who some of you may know. He was the Democratic Majority Leader and a representative from Bowdoinham. So a move in regards to who I worked for, from a Republican senator to a House Democratic leader in the state legislature. But really not a big move for me. I've been a registered Democrat since I was old enough to vote, and voted in the first election in 2000 as a senior in high school. So even at that time, I thought there's no way I would ever run for office. I actually, like many people that end up getting involved in state politics, declined requests that I run for office locally several times. Just said, no, I'm not interested in doing that. But there was an opening that came about prior to the 2014 election. And I actually decided that I was either going to get out of politics altogether, or I just dived in deeper by running for office. I really wanted to start making my own decisions on issues rather than advising people on how they should handle votes coming before them. And I had a specific goal in mind. I thought I would go to Augusta for a couple of years and really focus on how to increase access to VA resources for specifically my generation of veterans, with a real focus on access to mental health, which I thought there were some significant, gaps in what was available. One of the first ones that I had really identified just from talking to other men and women my age who had served in Afghanistan or Iraq was that we didn't have any inpatient care beds in the state of Maine in the VA system for substance use treatment, most often associated with mental health, things like post-traumatic stress. So that's not uncommon in Maine. You may know we have a severe lack of available inpatient treatment resources for everyone in the state. But in in the context of my life experience, and many of the people that served who were in my age, this was a real issue and one I really threw myself into. And I got to do a lot of good policymaking work in this space for 4 years in the state legislature. That was really my entry point into politics, and it's a very rewarding, although very frustrating line of work. I can assure you, if you find politics frustrating, then you probably have a sense of what I'm saying. But in my most cynical moments, when I look back at some of the things I've been able to help this state achieve, it makes it all worth it. So as an example, just last year, I finally was able to get the VA to commit to a 24-bed inpatient substance use treatment facility with co-occurring mental health treatment capabilities or trained staff. Took 7 years of constant advocacy, and it's going to make a big difference for a lot of people and for their families. So that's why you do it right there. In the last 2 years in Congress, I've also been able to preserve a health care tax credit that covers 70% of certain individuals' healthcare premiums here in the state of Maine. These are people who worked in some of our paper mills, who were impacted by foreign trade pressures, and their mills went through bankruptcies where their pensions were completely lost. And through a trade assistance program that Congress set up, they received this healthcare tax credit, but it was going to expire at the end of 2019. And for those workers who were in this situation, who were still younger than 65 and had no Medicare eligibility, this would represent a 70% increase in their healthcare costs overnight. And we've been able to extend that 2 years in a row, making sure that they continue to be able to have affordable access to good healthcare benefits. My proposal was to actually extend it for 5 years in order to create a full bridge to Medicare for this subset of workers. But for the time being, we've been able to successfully do it year after year, and we're going to keep fighting for it. Big impact on their lives right there as well. These are just the types of things that I take a lot of enjoyment in fighting for, being a part of. They're not like the big national headlines that you might often follow in the papers, but they're very meaningful, and it's, I think, indicative of the type of work that I devote most of my time or my staff time to pursuing. I could go on and on about what some of those other things are, but I am at this point in time 38 years old, going on 39, and when I think about being able to contribute to things like this that are having a big impact in a wider array of people's lives, individuals between 60 and 65 who've lost their pensions and might otherwise struggle to have health care, if not for getting that done, or the types of folks who are going to benefit from having access to substance use treatment. When that facility opens up next year here in Maine, it's just, I think, a really amazing opportunity, and one that I feel very fortunate to have. And I think that's why most people get into politics, despite many of the kind of cynical reporting out there about politics, about politicians. In most instances, I find good people all around me on both sides of the aisle with good intentions. The collective product that comes out of our national politics in Washington is much more difficult to discuss and explain. The gridlock, the failures, and the many challenges that we have in solving really big problems in this country, to include, by the way, climate change, as you all know. So I guess I would close with my call to action, which is really focused on HR 1. This is legislation passed in the House. It was our top priority legislation after the 2018 election. And it was largely my very large incoming freshman class, which had a lot of young new members of Congress who ran to try and bring big change and reform to our politics. When you think about campaign finance and all of the money that we see influencing our politics, access to voting, voting rights, which I think Maine does very well, but there are clear, pretty significant problems around the country. We have such high voter turnout in Maine. That's not true elsewhere. And I think that we just generally agree across party lines in Maine that we want more people voting, not less. And I think that holds true even, I think if you're a Democrat, would agree with me that we also want Republican voters to have greater ballot access and vice versa. It should not be a partisan thing. We want these people to vote, but not these people to vote. There's also just a lot of what I like to describe as soft corruption reforms in HR 1. Some of the abuses that we see that exist in the system, whether that be the type of like revolving door that people worry about with people leaving and going into lobbying, using public service as a stepping stone to a job on K Street, if you've heard of K Street, as the row in Washington full of lobby firms who pay big bucks, I think, to have a seat at the table, often disadvantaging everyday voters. That's what I mean when I talk about the kind of corrupting influence of money in politics. I rarely think it's actually a form of someone being, literally bought off or paid some kind of political bribe, but rather just the sheer volume of it. This bill seeks to deal with all of these things in many different ways. And I think that influence, whether it be the partisan desires to win elections and electoral politics of keeping some people from having a voice in politics, or just the sheer volume of money that sometimes causes people in Washington not to stay at the table and come up with real solutions and get things done, can explain why we can talk about something like climate change endlessly for decades on end without really making the types of progress and solutions that we need. So with that, I guess I would just ask that you join me in supporting that legislation, or even some aspects of it. I'm not a all or nothing type of person, in case you haven't noticed. If the only thing we can do in the Senate is break off bits and pieces of it, negotiate and compromise and make progress together now over these next 2 years, I'm for that. I don't take it or leave it approach. Half a loaf certainly better than no loaf, is what I was taught by older legislators. About how you have to approach fighting for meaningful change on a day-to-day basis. So call your senators, look at the bill, or ask Maureen or my office for more information if you just want to learn about it before calling to advocate that our senators support the legislation. But I think it would be incredibly meaningful on many, many fronts. Better politics, also hope we would then help better results on things like addressing climate change, whatever the other many priorities that you all may have and think are very pressing for the country.
Great, thank you so much, Congressman Golden. It's really interesting to hear. Oh, there's a little bit of feedback.
If I mute myself, I bet you that'll stop.
Okay, great, super. Thank you. It really is a pleasure to hear about your path to Congress, which seems like an unconventional one, and to hear a little bit more about your priorities this year. And we really appreciate your time and sharing your personal experience. And I think that's really important. So I thank you for that. Now, regulars to our Lunch and Learn know that before we get to questions, we first have a call to action. This week there are two, and I bet you can guess what one of them is. Congressman Golden teed it up, but the first one is letting people know how they can help keep in touch with you, how they can help, how they can keep in touch with your office. Congressman Golden has a great newsletter and shares updates and information on social media, all good ways Maine people can stay in touch. Now, the second action is a request to contact Maine Senators Susan Collins and Angus King to support HR 1, which is called For the People Act. It passed as HR 1 in the House. And as you heard, really strongly supported by Congressman Golden and also Maine conservation voters. The For the People Act would be the most significant voting rights and democracy reform measure in over a half a century. And I would just say, given the voter suppression legislation being passed in state legislatures across the country, including a terrible bill enacted into law yesterday in Georgia. The For the People Act is more important than ever. Later this afternoon, we'll send around a follow-up email with a recording of today's event, a link to sign up for Congressman Golden's newsletter, and details to help you urge Senators King and Collins to vote yes on the For the People Act. All right, now let's ask some questions. And the first one, Congressman, I think is fascinating that you were the first, and I'm sure people said like you couldn't do it, but you were the first person in over 100 years to defeat an incumbent representative in Maine's 2nd Congressional District. Last year, your district voted for former President Trump by over a 7% margin and also sent you back to Congress. So the question is, how did you pull it off?
Yeah, you know, we talk a lot about elected officials, you know, and we want to put them in very easy buckets. And people want to do that to me as well. So you're supposed to just, you know, be typecast for the Democrat or the Republican. I don't find that to be very helpful, to be honest with you, because that's not the type of person that I meet on a day-to-day basis as I go about doing this job, representing over 500,000 people. I find that a lot of my constituents, in fact, most of them hold both progressive values and conservative values, all wrapped up in one mind, and are very pragmatic as well in thinking about how to solve problems. I think most people are far less partisan than our politics are. So I've taken that approach to engaging with my constituents, and to the best of my ability, I take that approach in how I try to do the job. And I think that helps inform how I end up getting reelected by 6 points in a district that voted for President Trump, then President Trump by 7 points. There's a lot of split ticket voting here, defying national trends, which is not uncommon about Maine politics, actually. Our high voter turnout being one example. But I mean, there were actually, when you start digging into the data, a lot of Biden, Collins golden voters. There was also a lot of Trump, Collins golden voters. And when you go even further down ballot, you might be surprised sometimes the ways in which people will support for Democratic or Republican candidates across the full, you know, top to bottom of a ballot. So I don't know that I pulled anything off other than I tried to take the approach that is genuine. I tried to really explain myself. I can tell you national reporters sometimes ridicule my lengthy statements about the votes that I take, but my commitment to my constituents is that the bigger the vote, the longer the explanation, the more in-depth I will get. I really want people to you know, be able to see how not only the final decision I make, but how I got there. And I believe that we can often disagree with one another, but feel good about the process. And I think that's really important. The outcome matters most, but the process about how you get there also is very important. So I don't know if that answers the question, Maureen, but it's certainly a part of how I did it.
You did a great job answering the question. Thank you. And the second question is somewhat related. And you know, you've mentioned that climate change is such an important issue to address. And as you think about your district, which is, you know, mostly rural, not all, but mostly rural, what does climate action look like in a rural district?
I always think, you know, it's a complex issue. And there's, I think, a lot of I guess cross-partisan agreement, I would say, you know, in the farming community, in the fishing community. I think a lot of people are able to identify climate change as something that's taking place. You know, there may be some levels of disagreement about who's mostly responsible, or actually most often discussions about who ought to pay to address it, whether that be talking about mitigation in addressing the impacts of climate change on communities, on you know, industries like fishermen themselves, but also how to actually address it, try and either reverse it or prevent it from getting worse. So as an example, I think about a lot of people that I might meet that work in any number of paper mills in the state, many of whom are avid outdoorsmen, and care a lot about conservation, but also the health of our environment, who are also worried about the ways in which, let's say, renewable energy could fail to deliver on-demand power generation to the mill to protect their jobs and keep that going. And so, while they may agree that we need to address things like fossil fuel usage, which is helping to drive climate change, global warming, and other things. They're fearful of how the solutions may impact their way of making a living right now. And I think just in trying to focus pragmatically on working with people to understand what's possible today and what needs to be invested in to make what isn't possible yet possible tomorrow. It's just how I think about climate advocacy in the context of representing such a large district with a lot of different regions, ways of making a living, and a very diverse politically district as well.
Thank you.
Probably take 10 different approaches to answering that question.
Yeah, and I know you've also done some work with the Blue-Green Alliance, the intersection of like the building the clean energy economy while also reducing carbon pollution and how they really go hand in hand. So thank you for working at that intersection of labor and the environment. Several participants noted that you were the only Democrat in the House of Representatives to vote against the COVID relief bill called the American Rescue Plan. Could you please just share more about how you came to this decision?
Sorry, we have like a troublemaking cat making tons of noise in the house, that's all.
No problem.
Gotta love Zoom. Yeah, very tough decision. I tend to really try to think through these things. I think the first thing I would say is that I try to start from a place where I do not just automatically accept the talking points of the day or simply assume, I guess I would say you should, I believe, treat what you read about politics and policy debates in Washington as you read about it in the news or watch it on TV with a healthy skepticism. And the House of Representatives is really built for top-down leadership. I can tell you a lot of offices have maybe staff in situations where they get an email, here's your set of talking points, here's how you're going to vote, cut and paste this into your own press release, do with it what you will. But this is the message of the day for the Democratic House majority. I tell my staff that's not how we're going to do business. I expect them to really research the ins and outs, not only of the legislation, but how it will intersect with the state of Maine. If you go back to March of 2020, the CARES Act, very similar to the American Relief Plan, just voted on in, signed into law in March of 2021. I think the full context is how I ended up getting to yes on one and no on the other. I'm not a traditional budget hawk, I think one would say, particularly coming at the issue as a member of the Democratic Party, but now $6 trillion with this new plan in just 1 year's time is a lot of money. It just really is, and I don't take it lightly. As well as the next plan being discussed, adding another $3 trillion to that, $9 trillion in less than 18 months is an unthought of sum of money in my entire lifetime. And I have deep concerns about some of the decisions about how we will handle this either now or in the near-term future. Already a lot of debate about whether or not the $3 trillion infrastructure bill should be paid for or not. Given the high level of spending that's gone on in response to COVID, I think that it probably should be. I believe there's limits to how much we can spend in a specific amount of time or how much debt we can take on. But in the context of my research about Maine, I think the most important aspect of the American Relief Plan remains investment in people who continue to be out of work because their industry continues to face closures or reduced capacity, like we see at restaurants, and ensuring that they continue to get the income assistance that they need. That was probably the most pressing need. But let's just like break it up in short pieces. And I'll just give you a few examples. School funding, very important. Most of the school districts that I spoke to about their situation financially conveyed that they were having a hard time spending all of the federal money that I voted for and supported in the CARES Act and in the December legislation, which we often refer to as CARES 2. They won't even be able to spend all of that money before the end of 2021. Most of the school funding they will receive from this most recent legislation will be spent in 2022, 2023, and even 2024. So when you think about that in the context of the immediacy of the emergency for school funding versus weighing the risks and benefits of 6 trillion or 9 trillion in spending in a year and a half, I think that the bill was overshooting in that regard. Same with the rental assistance program. I voted for 30 billion in December. This new round adds 25 billion. Governor Mills has just in the last 2 weeks opened up the rental assistance program funded through the December bill. When you repeat that over and over across the many different provisions of the bill, I think you can see how you can go from 1.9 trillion to something more like 900 billion or a trillion. A year ago, I probably would have voted for this in the context of, the previous 4 trillion in spending. I think we need a more targeted approach.
Great, thank you for that. We have a follow-up with the current balance, related question, not exactly on the American Rescue Plan, but with the current balance of power, do you think the budget reconciliation process, which requires a simple majority, has a role to play to get priorities like infrastructure over the finish line?
Well, you can only do budget reconciliation a number of times. So again, I think it's also about setting priorities. I don't know if there's a tool to be used by the majority that speaks, more largely to what their top priorities are. A lot of people probably don't understand that, and I don't blame them. It's a complex process, but you can only have as many budget reconciliations as you do annual budgets. So this is not a pathway forward for a Democratic majority in the next 2 years to legislate beyond choosing a couple of top priorities. In this case, the Biden administration chose the COVID relief package. I think they probably could have gotten to a more targeted bill with bipartisan support that would have allowed them to preserve budget reconciliation for another important priority. But they are considering perhaps using it for infrastructure, Maureen, although the latest discussions are calling into question whether or not that is truly their current strategy. It seems that they want to start from a place of seeking bipartisan support or a bill that can get 60 votes in the Senate. So I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball about how that's going to play out over the next several weeks or 2 to 3 months. So I don't think that the vehicle has been determined yet. I don't know if that really answers the question or not.
That's great. That's really great information. Thank you so much. There are a lot of nerds on this call. It's helpful for you to provide a little more background. So just switching gears a little bit, what is your favorite legislative committee to be on and why?
Well, I'm on 2. There's a few others I'd love to be on, given the opportunity, but I'm on the Armed Services Committee. I enjoy, obviously, that being on that committee. I get to, I think, bring a different kind of background into the discussion. I'm one of only 2 prior enlisted. Many of the members on the committee are veterans, but a lot of them were on the officer side. It's just a different way of thinking about the impacts of policy making and the difference of thinking about what it means, I think, to send troops overseas to places like Afghanistan. I've also been pleased to have a platform to talk about my views about Congress and our need to, I think, take seriously the responsibility of voting for things like the authorization for the use of military force. Congress really has been silent on this going on 20 years now, and yet we are still deploying troops to places like Afghanistan and Iraq. And I've recently called for the president to stick to the May 1 deadline to bring our troops home from Afghanistan. That's my personal belief that it is time for that. Some people may not agree or have different viewpoints, but I see a lot of value in being on that committee. But to be honest, Maureen, I've really enjoyed being on the Small Business Committee. I'm learning a lot from being on that committee. Last time I was chairing a subcommittee on infrastructure and subcontracting, hearing from the perspective of a lot of small businesses who are often subject to being subcontractors with much bigger companies, taking government contracts and learning about some of the problems there, trying to address them, was great. But I'm very excited to have moved on to a new subcommittee I'm chairing. It's the Underserved Rural and Agricultural Subcommittee for the Small Business Committee. So right now we're working on trying to piece together a hearing to draw attention actually to the forest products industry in talking about climate change. A lot of people, I think, don't know about the value of how a healthy forest actually can help us deal with carbon in the atmosphere, and the importance of responsible timber harvesting, which I would say is how we do it in Maine compared to some of the practices practiced elsewhere in the country, or certainly in the world, where they're just clear cutting and releasing a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, as well as basically destroying what would otherwise be a healthy, sustainable, replenishable ecosystem like we have in Maine forest here. So we're going to have a hearing about that, and it will probably tie into discussions about the importance of things like tax credits and policies that could benefit things like biomass here in the state of Maine.
Great, thank you. And I just have to note that there's thunder and lightning where I live. And so if something happens, Beth Ahern, I deputize you to take over for me. So what related to what you were just talking about, a question came in about agriculture and what we could do to shift federal economic incentives away from destructive agricultural practices towards practices which might increase soil carbon sequestration. So you talked about the forestry aspect, but is there another rural component related to soils and farms?
Yeah, I'm actually interested in learning about all of that and using the committee as an avenue, not only for my own education about what some other responsible farming techniques may be that can help contribute to addressing climate change. Like, I am absolutely all for that, but it's also opportunities for my colleagues to learn from those. So it's just an example of how I'll use the committee. I think there's a lot of different ways we can have that conversation. In general, I have found that a lot of the focus when we talk about farming in Washington has a tendency to think about the Midwest farms, bigger farms than what we see here in Maine. And I'm going to guess ones that don't follow the same type of, at least more sustainable practices that we are used to here. So I think Maine has something to contribute to the conversation, but one that often gets ignored. But I'm all ears in learning more. I've actually done a lot of tours with different organic, smaller family-based farms here in the state of Maine, and I want to continue to hear more. So I guess if the person with the question wants to be a part of that conversation, please reach out.
Great, thank you for the invitation. So you and the entire Maine congressional delegation have been strong supporters of offshore wind and the University of Maine's Aquaventus project. There are a lot of various interests in this region. It's come out in the news lately. Fishermen, ironworkers, developers, the University of Maine. Is there room for everyone in the Gulf of Maine?
It's a good question. Yeah, there should be in theory. I think these projects take a lot of work. I think that the state has to be, look, first of all, we wasted a lot of time on the previous governor's administration when thinking about offshore wind. that's just a fact. I mean, we literally, he rejected federal dollars that were, the research and the work that's being done right now, all of that could have been done years ago, 5, 6 years ago, all put on hold. We almost lost the federal funding completely for that if it hadn't been for Senator King and Senator Collins, Congresswoman Pingree, and even Poliquin. The entire delegation really at that time had to fight to make sure that money was still available. And it's now being put, to good use, but it has set the clock back, which is really unfortunate. We've seen other people move into this space as a result, but there's a lot of energy potential in the Gulf of Maine when you think about wind or even tidal. And it's a big coastline. A lot of people talk about maximizing the full wind energy capacity would take about 2% of the coastline of Maine. And as a result, some people are very dismissive about the concerns of our fishing communities. I am not. I think that it's very important. The fishing, the lobster community, that's an entire economic, way of life right there. Without many communities on the coastline, specifically in my district, would be devastated. So I think they have a right to be concerned, and they have a right to have a seat at the table in these discussions. One of the biggest things I've heard is references to corporate greed. And I think we should acknowledge that. We see corporate greed in the fossil fuel industry. I don't think we should take it for granted that just because a source of energy is green and clean, that it is not subject to potential for corporate greed and abuse, and that it can have severe impacts on good, working middle-class people, or even fallout for underserved communities. So, I think engaging with them and making sure that their concerns are fully met is really important. One fisherman said to me, if they say they only need 2% to meet the state's energy needs, where's the profit, the excess profit going to come from? Probably 4%. But in his telling, wherever there's more money to be made, there will be a desire to expand further and further and further until they are no longer able to fish. That's not a crazy line of thought, in my opinion. So I'm glad that the approach is being taken right now as we roll out with the use of the federal dollars through the University of Maine to do the pilot project, to start these conversations now. I think it's really important. On the ironworkers aspect, look, if we're going to build it here in Maine, I think it ought to be built by Mainers to the greatest extent possible.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. There's another question here about the last year you voted for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, but this year you decided to cast your vote against it. Was there a change to the bill that you didn't support, or did something else change your mind?
It was actually the lack of a change to the bill. When I voted for the legislation last summer, I expressed concerns about a full elimination of what's called qualified immunity. Another complex issue. I don't know how much everyone who's joined us today has read into it or followed it, but like many things, I believe that a full repeal of qualified immunity is not the way to go. Qualified immunity protections are there for most every other public servant employee in across the board. Does it need to be fixed in how it is being put to use in the court system? Absolutely. And the actual history of the issue resides in, I think, a failure for Congress to clearly articulate its intent in the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And so we could fix this problem by instructing the courts what our clear intent is in regards to the degree of liability that a public employee carries or not, or is protected from, whether that be a police officer or a firefighter or a customs inspector, whatever it may be. Last year, I expressed a lot of skepticism that we were on a path in Congress to passing police reform because of this one issue. The Senate made very clear that they were not interested in repealing qualified immunity, but they were in agreement with about 80% of the bill beyond this one sticking point. And so I, at that time, called for a conference between the Senate and House, which never took place, and no police reform was passed. Nothing has changed at this point. We have the same two identical bills in the House and the Senate, and no real pathway forward to a negotiated settlement between the two, which sounds to me like another 2 years without any action. Look at the rest of that 80% of that bill, things like banning chokeholds, creating a system by which officers with a repetitive kind of behaviors of misconduct would be tracked across the nation so that they can't just leave one department in a state and go get a job somewhere else. We don't have that right now. We could have something like that. There's a lot of good in that bill, but none of it is likely to become law absent a willingness to negotiate on this issue of qualified immunity. I'm not offering a full-throated defense of it, but I don't think that the opposite of a complete elimination is the pathway forward.
Great, thank you. And then I have a little bit of a twofer for you on climate change. Carbon fee and dividend, do you support that idea? And then there's another question about the growing, last year you were a co-sponsor of the Growing Climate Solutions Act. Do you see yourself supporting that bill again? So there's another question too about 2019 Climate Action Now Act. So I guess maybe if you could talk about what you're excited about on the climate front, and then specifically, do you support carbon fee and dividend?
There's a lot wrapped up into that one. I think I might ask for follow-up on the other bills, and let's just talk about carbon dividend right now, because I think it's a timely conversation. Thinking about the potential infrastructure bill that is being discussed, and a big portion of that would be looking at things like infrastructure investments to address climate change. So that can mean a lot of different things, obviously. Things like investments in renewable energy, maybe investment in our grid to help with the transmission of that energy, or storage, capacity within our communities to store that energy so it can be used when it's needed. There's a lot of investments that need to be made, all on the climate change front. Infrastructure isn't just about roads and bridges, although I think that has got to be a big part of the bill as well. But when we start talking about how to pay for it, and again, if a $3 trillion bill on top of the $6 trillion we've done in response to COVID brings us to $9 trillion in spending in less than 2 years, it's hard to even talk about how much spending that really is. I don't think any of you have ever seen that level of spending from Congress. Look at the 2017 Republican tax cut, which was $2 trillion over 10 years. And a lot of people felt like that was very fiscally irresponsible because, again, it wasn't paid for. I just think we got to solve this issue. It doesn't have to be all about raising taxes, although it should probably be part of the mix. Talking about things like carbon dividend is a way to talk about how we might pay for portions of this. Some people are starting to talk about things like vehicle miles traveled to reflect the reality that improving fuel efficiency, which is a good thing, is also making the gas tax really unsustainable as a way to pay for our transportation infrastructure. So I'm excited about the possibilities for what that bill could produce in regards to how we change the way we pay for our infrastructure, but also how we might pay for some of these things on the climate front as well. I think the devil's in the details on what you mean when you say, carbon fee and how the money gets used. At the end of the day, I feel like my constituents care how things get paid for. And they're not instinctually opposed to taxes, but I think that they want to know what it's going towards. Think about like the 2016 voter referendum to increase taxes on income over $200,000 to pay for public education. I think a lot of people voted for that because they knew it was going to public education. Perhaps they wouldn't have supported it simply to put resources into the general fund. So I think that this is an intriguing conversation in the context of, what do we need to do, and how are we willing to pay for it? And I think that really matters to a lot of my constituents. I guess what I'm saying is some people may oppose one tax cut devoid of a reason and an explanation of what for. They may support it if they support where it will be going or what it will be paying for.
Great, thank you. I think we might have time for 2 more questions. And one of them, we received several people asking about what can we do to stop further mass shootings, which, tragedy in the news, gun control. Could you talk a little bit more about your stance on gun control and what we can do to stop this phenomenon in America?
Yeah, I think that throughout my entire time in politics, I have seen the same repeating cycle that you have, which is after most of these mass shootings, we kind of see kind of people going into their corners and not much coming out of it. The one, I think, real big effort I watched was in 2013, which came close but failed, and that was the Mansion Toomey proposal. Which would have expanded background checks on advertised sales, such as internet advertisements or other, let's say, paid advertisements in printed publications. As an example, different than HR 8, which I voted against, which is seeking to expand background checks even on personal transfers. I really think that we are best served by trying to focus on good policies that we're able to pass into law. And I think details really matter. And this is a tough space. It's emotionally charged. I think everyone agrees that it's very emotionally charged on both sides. And if we can't dig into the process of having hearings, of having committee markups, and bringing votes forward with compromise, then we probably will see very little progress made. My voting record is I think sought the most productive outcomes that I can. I one, respectful of the Second Amendment, to be completely honest, and at the same time have shown a willingness to support regulation where I think it makes most sense. Here in Maine, I voted for legislation where we have individuals convicted of domestic abuse to lose their right to own a firearm for a specified amount of time. Cooling off period is how it's often referred to, which made a lot of sense because that is the #1 driver of gun-related homicides in the state of Maine. In fact, the #1, I think, driver of homicides in Maine. So we had a policy problem with a solution that would work in addressing it. Where we see individuals with a pattern of abusive or violent behavior, I think we see a need to regulate and ask ourselves whether or not they surrendered their right to have possession of a firearm, any type of firearm. That's just an example of how I think about the issue. I question, to be completely straightforward, the effectiveness of bans of specific products and as well as the legality of them. Many of these policies, when passed, are likely to face court challenges. And that is a third branch of the co-equal system of government.
Great. So someone asked, as I speak with some teens, they seem to have lost trust in all institutions, but especially the institutions that support politics. If you used to feel similarly about mistrusting the process and institutions, what might you say to young people about what helped you make the leap toward trust in this process now, so that they may embrace and do the same?
I think to be optimistic about it, I'm just always encouraged to hear that teenagers are engaging with our politics and thinking deeply about policies and trying to solve problems in this country, because I really didn't think about politics at all when I was 15 or 16 or 17 years old. I don't think I really started thinking much about politics until I was in uniform and serving overseas in Afghanistan and Iraq. And even then, I didn't really truly dig into it until I was well into my 20s. So I want teenagers to stay engaged. Politics influences every aspect of your life. It's all around you. And I think that civic engagement at the earliest of ages is really important To be honest, in the HR 1 debate, the bill that I called for support for at the beginning of this hour, there was an amendment to allow 16-year-olds to vote. And my gut instinct was not to support it. I looked back at my old 16-year-old self and thought, geez, I wasn't very well informed, and we do want informed voters. But actually, it was thinking about how I have engaged with many teenagers as an elected official and the advocacy that I see the present generation engaging in that led me to believe, well, maybe they're just more in tune and paying attention than I was. And in fact, many of them can articulate their thoughts and feelings about politics and the problems in our country better than many an adult. So I ultimately voted for the amendment. So however it is that you're engaging, I guess I would say it works. In the context of the story I just told you, that moved me to support ballot access for 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds who don't currently have it. I'd like to see more people voting. Obviously, there's a limit, but I think 16 is probably the right one at this time.
Great, thank you. I think we are going to end it there. We are so grateful for your service to the people of Maine and for your leadership on voting rights, campaign finance reform, climate change, and environmental protection. And I failed to mention at the beginning in the introduction that you have a 97% score from the League of Conservation Voters, which of course is very important to point out. We are so glad that you were able to join us today and that you were so generous with your time. And thank you to everyone on this Lunch and Learn for joining and for offering such thoughtful questions. We hope to see you here in this space next Friday at noon for a deep dive on phasing out toxic PFAS chemicals and the bill Representative Lori Gramlich has introduced in the state legislature. In addition to Representative Gramlich, Gail Carson, the director of the Buck Lab for Climate and Environment at Colby College, and Sarah Woodbury, director of advocacy at Defender Health, will share their work to stop contamination of these forever chemicals at the source and how you can help their efforts this session. Till then, thank you all. Again, a very big thank you to Congressman Jared Golden, and have a beautiful weekend.